Good morning. Welcome to this week's reflection. I'm going to probably primarily be focusing on Inoue because A, I love the guy and his ideas. I did the exact same swoon as Grace did when you mentioned him. And B, he seems to be this polarizing figure within education because, as I'll talk about in a bit, I legit had a fellow student, during our little workshopping bit, we got sidetracked in talking about the readings, and they said that they were like, I'm just not going to even engage in this because, the idea that somehow um academia has this habitus of whiteness and it is a colonized thing that we are trying to decolonize apparently is a hard thing for them to accept and a pill to swallow and to deal with. And I think that Inoue isn't necessarily trying to attack the systems like some people feel he is. But I'll get to that. But I wanted to start by talking about this week's creative project a little bit because my little summary about the justification will probably fall very short of adequately describing what inspired this project. First and foremost, this is the creative work that was inspired by this week, or one of the creative works. It's the best one so far. Wow, you gotta go the opposite ways. It looks like a horrible furniture sofa pattern from the 70s, and that's because it's supposed to be. And the idea behind this was I wanted to try to draw from memory a vivid staple of my childhood, and that was my grandpa's chair. There will also probably be one of my grandma's couch on my mom's side. And I'm sure you can relate to this. There's a vivid thing in your childhood that somebody had that you remember vividly one way, and when you reminisce with cousins, brothers, sisters, inevitably somebody's like, no, 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 no. And this chair has been a thing that has been in my family, a bone of contention. We look at pictures and we can see what it is, but a lot of times when we've talked about it without the pictures, it takes so many different shapes. I swear it's floral and paisley print with blue and green on yellow, and my sister swears it is a champagne color with yellow, orange, and brown, and no blue, no green. But anyways, there's always this competition between my memories of childhood and my sister's memory of childhood and my cousins, and when we come together, those all clash and create a sort of communal memory that is close enough to the real thing, like the uncanny, which Trig and his memory of place did inspire this in the talks that he had about how certain spaces invoke certain feelings. I tried to do that with certain patterns and colors because, like I said, I find this interesting because when reminiscing with my cousins, all of our memories come together to create a close enough representation of our childhood and the reality that we experienced back then that we can get into it. But it's never actually going to be the correct, and it's never going to be what we actually experience. It's always going to be mediated through the brain, through the memory, and that's what inspired this project. And hopefully in 600-700 words I can say that again, and there will be multiple paintings, but that's what inspired this, is Trig and that memory of place and wanting to try to recapture the past through just memory only and seeing what happens. I'm going to send a picture of this to my sister and she's going to be like, what the fuck is that? And I'm going to say it's Grandpa's chair, and she's going to be like, no, it's not. But that's the whole thing, and maybe I can even talk my sister into painting one. Probably not. She's a busy woman with 5 kids. But that's what inspired that, just in case my explanation with this on Sunday when it's all uploaded fails. That's the explanation. Anyways, but Inoue. Back to Inoue. I wanted to talk about Inoue because, as I pointed out, when you bring him up, I swoon the same way Grace swooned. Sarah Smith probably was on board. Most of us who worked with Justin last year kind of were awoken to Inoue. At least I was, because I came in thinking yes, academia is a habitus of whiteness, to use his thing, in a very colonized space. But I thought that schooling kind of evenly prepared people across the board, and that was naivete on my part because I don't understand. And I thought even at a state level, given academic, like Common Core state standards and what schools are being held to, and the hell that like student teachers are put through in terms of being told, here's how you craft like standards, here's how you meet them, and trying to make education uniform in that sort of a way, and its own thing, and that's its own habitus of whiteness. But I never thought that there was that big of a gap between what students were taught in one school and another in terms of being prepared to participate or compete within that academic habitus of whiteness that Inouye talks about, and that we kind of tried to talk about, but some people seem to be shut down to the idea because it attacks their core beliefs. That it feels like it makes them out to be the bad guy, and it's not making them out to be the bad guy. Like larger capital C culture, like Eurocentric culture, that's what I'm going to call all of the whiteness that we are, is American and Eurocentric culture. Like that sort of preference for its own language, its own academic circles, that sort of a thing is bad in my opinion, and is a sort of thing that needs to be attacked and changed. But individuals who participate within that system and don't see the flaws as readily as others aren't the people who I would rally against. And I feel like sometimes students and teachers have a hard time making that distinction because they enjoy how they teach, and they're like, well, if how I'm teaching is part of this, then it's me you have a problem with. And that's not necessarily the case, but I just keep rambling here, but I wanted to talk about Inouye because I really do agree with him. I think that academia is very steeped in Eurocentric white language, and it is the dominant mode of communication within that, and we like to pretend that somehow if students aren't communicating to that level, that we somehow cannot decipher what they are saying within. And I'm going to stick to like the English language specifically, using non-standard English, African American English, any sort of like modifier on just traditional English you can put for dialectics or slang, because we like to pretend like those are all foreign languages, that somehow if a student says, I sawed something instead of seen, and they don't have that they haven't moved past that tense issue, like I sawed it versus I seen him do it or whatever, like, you know, those are both terrible sounding sentences. Like, teachers somehow like to pretend that seeing a student say, I saw this, and seeing in the context of the sentence, like, you can see that they are trying to say they saw with their eyes, but the tense is wrong. They pretend like somehow that sentence loses all meaning or ability to be because of this one wrong tense, or just leaving out prepositions or different things that we do within language. They somehow like to pretend that somehow it becomes illegible, audible. I don't know how, like, it can't be read, it can't be, it can't be understood by those in the positions of academia, and I find that kind of bullshit, not gonna lie, because we are smart people, we can figure it out, and I feel like this is just getting off on a rant, but I agree with Inouye that we should try and decolonize the classroom and bring in other forms of English instead of just standard English, and learn to communicate in other modes besides just standard English of I cannot do this, being very formal. And I think that that's something that needs to be explored, because and I think, and this is probably going to get me into this goes into controversy, I think that it needs to be done more that way for native English speakers within America who have been subjected to just levels of disenfranchisement and disadvantage through the education system, because as Alex brings up, and others who English is not their primary language, like the English education that they tend to get in a country where English is being learned as a second language is actually far more in depth than the education you or I get as native English speakers for the most part, unless we are part of a niche group who really enjoys academics or linguists or any of that sort of stuff. Like, just coming from a background where my father got his high school GED at 50 something years old, my mom got her diploma and an AA certificate, and was raising kids at 21. Like, English wasn't emphasized in terms of being grammatically correct. It was just something we spoke and I was immersed in, and I just kind of learned things in, like, verb, noun, subject, object, all of these parts of speech I didn't really learn until grade school, and even then, like, it was just breezed over because, like, you're English speakers, you get this. Like, a noun is a person, place, or thing, and a verb is an action. Like, those are the definitions I still remember in my head, and I don't barely. I have a better understanding because of college and grammar books, but I still don't have near the level of understanding of how English works on a grammatical, like, sentence structure level as somebody who has learned this as a second language. And I bring that up because when we talked about it, it seemed to be focused primarily on English as a second language, and how the proper English habitus of whiteness was not was disadvantageous to them. And I think it's disadvantageous to most anybody who isn't raised with a elitist education. And I don't know how else to put this, because most public schools do not emphasize the sort of grammatical things that we do in the academic circles. And it's kind of odd that we, like, are supposedly preparing students to go to college and not actually preparing them to participate in that environment. And again, my eyes were open to this, like, my first quarter of Teaching 101. I came in thinking everybody's kind of the same until I read a paper from a Running Start student at Mount Spokane. And he was, I don't want to say he was a naturally gifted writer, but he was a good writer for 16 years old, and he had a better grasp of writing than a student who was in their first freshman quarter of Eastern, who had graduated from public high school in Tacoma. Like, what was expected of this student to be ready for the real world or academics was not the same standard that the student in Meade, Mount Spokane, like, more affluent schools are being held to in sophomore and junior year. I mean, my nephew, he's out at West Valley, and it's not a high-end school, but he's reading Edgar Allan Poe and things that I didn't get exposed to. And this might even be a generational gap till, like, later in high school. And now kids are being exposed in junior high school to what we were being exposed to in freshman year of college. But that's its own thing. But just what they're being expected to do, like, they talk about psychoanalytic stuff, they talk about unreliable narrator, they get into actual close readings in a sophomore English class, or junior English class, I'm sorry. Whereas students in other schools, like, clearly aren't being pushed to that level. I feel like I'm just reiterating the same thing, but I feel like Inouye is onto something here. We'll close this up with a statement. I really do feel like Inouye is onto something here, that we need to figure out how to make academics more inclusive, and we need to figure out how to make it a thing that can bridge the gap instead of, like, divide it further. And I think that's something we've talked about, is, like, there's a lot of gatekeeping within the academic community, that you have to be academic and participate and do this or that to this level to even get in. So there are people who have great ideas, who have knowledge, but because they're not performing at that level of, like, jargon or writing ability, they're just dismissed, and that is really disappointing. And I think that we need to figure out how to decolonize the classroom and stop making Eurocentric, white-centric, whatever you want to call it. Like, we have to stop making those the predominant or the correct ways to do things and the preferred ways. We need to figure out new things here. Yeah, that's where I'm going to go, and that's where I'm going to stop. Have a good weekend, and have fun looking at my terrible paintings.